The courtyard of Ashmore Castle had gone completely silent. Hundreds of soldiers stood frozen in place, spears lowered, breath held. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. In the center of the stone courtyard stood a beast the size of a war horse, its white fur soaked red with the blood of a battle that had ended only an hour ago. Its chest rose and fell in heavy, furious breaths. Its pale silver eyes swept across every face around it, daring someone to come closer. For 450 years, this beast had never bowed. Not to kings. Not to queens. Not to generals who claimed they could tame anything with a blade or a whip. It answered to no one but itself, and tonight, drenched in the aftermath of war, it looked ready to tear apart the next living thing that dared approach it. The Alpha King himself stood near the castle steps, his armor cracked, his face pale with exhaustion. He raised a hand toward the beast and called its name. The beast did not even turn its head. Then, from the far side of the courtyard, a woman walked forward carrying nothing but a wooden bucket of water. Guards shouted at her to stop. The king ordered her back. She ignored every voice around her, her eyes fixed only on the animal in front of her. She knelt a few feet away, set the bucket down, and reached out her hand. The beast's eyes locked on hers. Every soldier in that courtyard believed they were about to watch her die.
You are safe
Instead,
now, my friend.
she leaned closer and whispered 3 quiet words against its ear. The impossible happened. The white beast lowered its massive head until its nose touched the stone floor of the courtyard, bowing before a maid for the first time in 4.5 centuries. Nobody breathed. Nobody understood. And somewhere behind that silence, an old, forgotten promise had just woken up. Chapter 1, The Beast That Never Bowed. Her name was Alicia, and 2 days before that night, she had been nothing more than a maid who scrubbed castle floors and fed stray animals nobody else cared about. Ashmore was a kingdom built on strength. Its people believed that fear kept order and that power alone kept a throne standing. The Alpha King, a man named Weston, had ruled for 11 years with that same belief carved into his bones. He was fair, but he was hard, and he trusted very few people beyond his own guard. Beside him always stood the white beast, a guardian older than the kingdom's written history. Nobody knew exactly what it was. Some called it a wolf grown too large for its own legend. Others whispered it was something closer to a spirit wearing fur and teeth. It fought beside the king in every war and returned from every battle covered in blood that nobody was ever allowed to wash away. Alicia had grown up hearing those stories from her grandmother, a quiet woman named Odette who had once served in the castle before Alicia was even born. Odette used to tell her that true strength never needed to shout. She said kindness was the only kind of power that never ran out. Alicia believed her, even when the other maids laughed at her for feeding wounded birds instead of ignoring them, even when the head housekeeper scolded her for wasting time on animals that could not repay her. On the night the army returned from battle, the white beast came back wounded in spirit more than in body. It had lost soldiers it had fought beside for years. It refused every command. It snapped at anyone who came within 10 feet of it. The Alpha King tried to calm it himself and failed for the first time anyone could remember. That was the night Alicia stepped into the courtyard with a bucket of water and 3 words her grandmother had taught her long before she died. Nobody in the castle would ever look at her the same way again. Chapter 2, 3 Forgotten Words. By morning, the story had already spread through every hallway of the castle. Some servants whispered that Alicia had used witchcraft. Others said she must have known the beast from somewhere hidden in her past. The bravest of the guards admitted, quietly, that they had never felt so much fear and so much wonder within the same breath. The Alpha King summoned her to the throne room. She walked in with her hands still raw from scrubbing floors that morning, her apron slightly damp, her hair falling loose from its tie. She did not look like someone who had just changed the fate of a kingdom. He asked her plainly where she had learned those words. She told him the truth. Her grandmother had taught them to her as a child, saying only that they belonged to someone who once cared for the king's line long before his birth. Alicia had never known what they meant. She had simply carried them the way she carried every other lesson Odette had given her, without question, without expecting to use them. Weston studied her for a long moment. He had spent his whole life believing that loyalty was something you commanded. He did not understand how a servant with no title and no army could earn something from his own guardian beast that he himself had never received. He ordered the royal archivists to search every record in the castle for any mention of those words. Until then, he told her, she would care for the beast herself, since it clearly would allow no one else near it. Alicia did not know whether to feel honored or afraid. She only knew that when she returned to the beast that evening, it lifted its head and pressed its nose gently against her palm, as if it had been waiting its whole long life for exactly this. Chapter 3, A Bond Beyond Fear. The following weeks changed the rhythm of the entire castle. Alicia spent her mornings cleaning floors and her afternoons sitting beside the white beast in the stone courtyard, cleaning its wounds, brushing tangles from its fur, and talking to it the way she used to talk to injured birds nobody else bothered to save. Other servants tried to copy her, hoping the beast would show them the same trust. One young stable boy attempted to imitate her calm voice and slow movements, only to end up sprinting across the yard when the beast growled at his clumsy approach. The other maids laughed about it for days, and even Alicia found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. The beast, which the older guards had simply called Ashen for generations, began following her through the halls whenever it was allowed. It waited outside the kitchen while she worked. It walked beside her to the well every morning. Soldiers who once feared it now stepped aside to let it pass, watching in quiet disbelief as the fiercest creature in the kingdom trailed behind a maid like a loyal shadow. One afternoon, a young kitchen boy named Dolan bet his friends a week's worth of bread that he could get the beast to follow him the same way it followed Alicia. He borrowed her exact tone of voice, her exact walk, even the way she tilted her head when she spoke softly. The beast simply stared at him, unimpressed, until he took one step too close, at which point he abandoned all his careful planning and ran across the yard so fast he nearly knocked over a cart of turnips. The story spread through the servants' quarters for a week, and even the head housekeeper, a stern woman who rarely smiled, had to hide a laugh behind her sleeve. The Alpha King watched all of this from a distance more often than he would admit. He told himself he was simply monitoring the beast's health. In truth, he found himself curious about the woman who had done what centuries of kings could not. He began finding reasons to walk through the courtyard at the same hour she was there. Their conversation started small, questions about the beast's mood, updates on its wounds. He would ask stiff, formal questions, and she would answer honestly, sometimes bluntly, in a way none of his advisors ever dared. She once told him plainly that he stood like a man expecting an attack even when no danger was near, and instead of taking offense, he found himself standing a little differently for the rest of that day, testing whether she was right. Slowly, their conversations grew into something neither of them expected, stretching longer each evening, lingering past the point where either of them had a real reason to still be standing in that courtyard. Chapter 4, Secrets Buried in History. The royal archivists finally uncovered something buried deep within the oldest records of the kingdom, written in a dialect so old that only one elderly scholar in Ashmore could still read it. 450 years earlier, the very first Alpha King had made a promise to the original White Beast, the ancestor of the one Alicia now cared for. The promise was simple. The beast would protect the kingdom not out of fear or command, but because the king and his descendants would rule with mercy. If that mercy ever disappeared from the throne, the beast owed no loyalty to the crown at all, only to whoever still carried that mercy in their heart. The 3 words Alicia had spoken were part of an old vow exchanged between that first king and the beast, a phrase meant to be passed down only to someone the beast itself recognized as worthy. Weston sat with that information long into the night. His father and grandfather had ruled through strength and punishment, and he had followed the same path without ever questioning it. Now he understood why the beast had grown more distant with every passing generation. It had been waiting, silently, for someone who still remembered what the crown was originally built on. He began asking Alicia more questions, not about the beast, but about her grandmother, her childhood, and the quiet philosophy she carried about kindness being a form of courage rather than weakness. For a king who had spent his whole life believing that softness invited danger, her answers unsettled something deep inside him, in the best possible way. Chapter 5, Whispers in the Court. Not everyone in the castle welcomed the change. A group of nobles led by an advisor named Alden saw Alicia's rising influence as a threat to their own comfortable positions. They began spreading rumors that she had bewitched the beast, or worse, that she planned to manipulate the king himself for her own gain. Alden had secretly been meeting with representatives from the neighboring kingdom of Drenmark, a rival power that had wanted to weaken Ashmore's defenses for years. He saw in Alicia's growing bond with the beast something dangerous, a shift in loyalty that could no longer be controlled by the nobles who had always managed the throne from the shadows. At a public gathering meant to celebrate the harvest, Alden stood before the court and accused Alicia openly of sorcery, demanding she be removed from the castle before her influence spread any further. The room fell into tense murmurs. Alicia stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, refusing to shrink under the weight of every eye in the room. Weston stepped forward before anyone else could speak. He reminded the court that centuries of kings had tried to command the beast through fear and failed, while a servant with no army and no noble blood had earned its trust with nothing but patience and kindness. He asked the nobles a simple question. If compassion was truly a weakness, why had it succeeded where their swords and threats had not? Alden had no answer that satisfied the room. But behind his forced smile, his plans with Drenmark only grew more urgent. Chapter 6, Hearts Behind Armor. Despite the rumors swirling through the court, something gentle continued growing between Alicia and Weston. Their conversations no longer stayed near the beast's stall. He began walking with her along the castle gardens in the evenings, sharing burdens he had never spoken aloud to anyone, including the loneliness of ruling a kingdom that respected him out of fear rather than love. She told him about her grandmother's final years, how Odette used to say that a crown built on fear was a crown built on sand, always one storm away from collapsing. She told him about the birds she used to nurse back to health as a child, how her father used to tease her for caring more about broken wings than broken dishes. He found himself laughing more in her presence than he had in years, a low, surprised sound that seemed to catch even him off guard. She teased him gently about his stiff formal posture, and he admitted that no one in the castle had ever dared tease him about anything. One evening, beneath the soft orange light of a setting sun, he took her hand and admitted quietly that he no longer knew how to separate the king's duty from the man who simply wanted to stand beside her. She did not pull away. Instead, she told him that a good king and a good man were never truly separate at all, only the same person choosing kindness even when it cost him comfort. Their closeness deepened slowly, built on trust rather than title, on quiet evenings rather than grand declarations, until neither of them could imagine facing whatever came next without the other standing close. One night, after a long day spent tending to the beast's wounds, she found him alone on the castle balcony, staring out at the dark hills beyond the walls. She did not ask why he looked so tired. She simply stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and waited until he was ready to speak. He told her that every king before him had ruled through distance, keeping their hearts locked away so no enemy could ever use them as a weapon. He admitted that keeping that same distance from her had become the hardest thing he had ever tried to do. She turned to face him, her eyes steady, and told him that a heart kept locked away was still a heart that could be broken, only more slowly, more quietly, with no one ever allowed close enough to help mend it. She reached up and rested her hand against his jaw, and for a long moment neither of them moved. When he finally leaned down and kissed her, it was slow and certain, the kind of kiss that came from months of careful restraint finally giving way. She kissed him back without hesitation, her fingers curling into the front of his tunic, and for the first time in years, Weston allowed himself to simply feel something without weighing its cost to the crown. They stayed on that balcony long after the torches burned low, trading quiet words and softer touches, learning each other in a way neither title nor duty had ever allowed before. When she finally returned to her small room near the servants' quarters that night, she carried with her a warmth that no royal decree could have given her, and a certainty that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Chapter 7, Betrayal Before Dawn. Alden's patience ran out before the season changed. Late one night, hired men slipped into the servants' quarters where Alicia slept, under orders to remove her from the castle permanently before she could uncover more of the ancient records or gain any more influence over the throne. The white beast, restless and alert in a way none of the guards understood, broke free from its usual resting place near the stables and reached her door only moments before the intruders did. Its roar shook the entire wing of the castle awake. Guards rushed in to find the beast standing protectively over her, teeth bared toward two men who had frozen in place, weapons dropped, faces pale with terror. Weston arrived within minutes, fury replacing the calm command he usually carried. The captured men, under pressure from the king's own interrogation, confessed that Alden had ordered the attack and had been receiving support from Drenmark for months. The court finally saw what Alicia had known all along, that the true danger to the kingdom had never come from a maid with a kind heart, but from those inside the palace walls who valued their own comfort over the safety of everyone else. Alden fled the castle before morning, escaping into the night with whatever loyal men remained on his side, but the damage to his reputation could not be undone. The kingdom now understood that Drenmark's ambitions were closer than anyone had feared. Chapter 8, The Kingdom Under Siege. Weeks later, Drenmark's army marched on Ashmore's borders, no longer hiding their intentions. The kingdom scrambled to prepare. Farmers picked up old family swords. Blacksmiths worked through the night forging new blades. Alicia, instead of retreating to safety as many expected, organized the healers and gathered supplies, insisting that courage on a battlefield meant nothing without care waiting behind it. She moved through the castle with a calm authority nobody had seen in her before, directing servants to prepare bandages, clean water, and quiet rooms for the wounded who would soon return. Even the nobles who once mocked her found themselves following her instructions without argument, recognizing something steady and necessary in the way she carried herself under pressure. The white beast fought alongside Weston at the front lines, fiercer and more focused than it had been in years, no longer driven purely by fury but by something closer to purpose. Soldiers who once feared standing near it now found comfort in its presence, watching it protect the wounded as fiercely as it attacked the enemy. The battle raged for 2 long days. Ashmore's walls held, barely, weakened by the sheer size of Drenmark's forces and the traitors who had once weakened the kingdom's defenses from within. On the first night, Alicia moved between rows of wounded soldiers with barely any rest, her hands stained with blood that was not her own, her voice calm even as young men cried out in pain around her. She learned the names of soldiers she had never met before, promising each one that their families would know exactly how bravely they had fought. A young guard named Tobin, barely older than a boy, gripped her hand so tightly it left marks, and she stayed beside him until the healers assured her he would live to see morning. Between shifts, she caught only brief moments of sleep, waking each time to the distant sound of horns signaling another wave of attacks. She thought of her grandmother's words often during those long hours, that kindness required more courage than any sword, and she understood now, more than ever, exactly what Odette had meant. On the final night, as exhaustion spread through every soldier still standing, word reached the castle that Drenmark's main force had broken through the eastern gate. Chapter 9, The Promise Remembered. The castle gates cracked under the weight of Drenmark's siege engines, and for a moment, it seemed as though Ashmore's 4 centuries of strength would finally crumble. Weston stood at the front line, wounded and surrounded, refusing to retreat while his people still fought behind him. The white beast fought beside him, bleeding from a dozen wounds, moving slower with every passing minute. Alicia arrived at the gates just as the last line of defense began to break, ignoring every warning to stay back. She knelt beside the beast, placing her palm against its bloodied fur, and whispered the same 3 words she had spoken on the night they first met. The beast rose despite its wounds, and instead of charging blindly into the chaos, it let out a call that echoed across the entire battlefield, a sound that seemed to reach every loyal soldier still standing. Guards who had wavered found new strength. Soldiers who had begun retreating turned back toward the gates. In the confusion, several of Drenmark's own commanders were exposed as having been secretly working alongside Alden, promised power in exchange for opening the gates from within. Their betrayal, once hidden, became their downfall, as Ashmore's remaining loyal forces used the confusion to turn the tide of the battle. By the time the sun rose, Drenmark's forces retreated, their plan for conquest broken not by brute strength alone, but by loyalty that fear could never have purchased. Weston, badly wounded but alive, looked toward Alicia across the smoke-covered courtyard and understood, finally and completely, what his ancestors had promised the White Beast 450 years earlier. Chapter 10, A Kingdom Reborn. Peace returned to Ashmore slowly, the way morning light returns after a long, heavy storm. The traitorous nobles who had conspired with Drenmark were exposed and exiled, their titles stripped, their influence erased from the court they had once manipulated from the shadows. Alden was never seen in Ashmore again. Weston, recovering from his wounds, called together the entire court and declared changes that shocked even his oldest advisors. He established new schools open to every child regardless of birth. He created sanctuaries for injured animals across the kingdom, inspired by the woman who had once nursed broken wings back to health without expecting anything in return. He reformed the old laws, ensuring that titles could be earned through service and character rather than simply inherited through blood. Standing before the entire kingdom, with the White Beast resting calmly at her side, Weston took Alicia's hand and declared her his equal, not because of any crown or title, but because she had proven, through every quiet act of kindness, what true strength actually looked like. Some of the older nobles who had once doubted her stood quietly in the crowd, remembering how they had laughed at a servant who fed injured birds instead of ignoring them. None of them laughed now. A few even bowed their heads slightly as she passed, a small gesture that meant more to her than any grand title ever could. The White Beast lowered its head once more, this time not from surprise or forced instinct, but from choice, kneeling before the entire kingdom as a living symbol that loyalty earned through compassion always outlasts loyalty demanded through fear. In the months that followed, Ashmore slowly became a kingdom known for something beyond its army. Travelers spoke of the animal sanctuaries scattered across its hills, of the schools where a farmer's child sat beside a noble's son, of a king and a queen who walked among their people without armor, without fear, trusting the same mercy that had once seemed like weakness to everyone who came before them. Alicia never forgot where she came from. She still visited the kitchen some mornings, still fed the birds that gathered near the castle walls, still spoke to servants the same way she always had, without distance, without pretense. The White Beast remained close to her for the rest of its long life, a quiet reminder that the greatest bonds are never built through command, only through patience and care given without expecting anything in return. Alicia, once an overlooked maid who scrubbed castle floors and fed forgotten creatures nobody else cared for, became the kingdom's most trusted keeper and the future queen of Ashmore, standing beside a king who had finally learned that mercy was never a weakness at all. It was, in the end, the strength nobody had expected, carried quietly by someone the world had almost overlooked completely. If this story moved you, subscribe to see how the rest of our story unfolds, and comment below where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going together.